Travel is a very interesting topic when we're talking about the 18th century. You know, a lot of people say, I wish I lived in a simpler time. I wish I lived, in the 1700s. Well, when we start to think about and conceptualize travel in the 18th century, I think many of us will realize just how amazingly fortunate we are to live right here, right now. I've got a journal and a couple of memoirs from folks that were traveling from Europe to North America by sea here in the 1770s, and we can imagine how difficult that was. They have some very real difficulties. Number one, it's dangerous to travel. Ships sink all the time in the 18th century. It's a long journey, 15 weeks, 16 weeks, maybe 20 weeks traveling on board these ships, and there's no resupply during that time period. So they have to have food that stays good that whole time, and there are not very many choices. Salting and drying are the main preservation methods for food. And then water is the big problem. Water goes bad. If you don't have fresh water, water in these barrels after, a month, 2 months, it starts to get green and slimy. And the worst part, probably the scariest thing that's going to happen on board ship, I don't know, storms are pretty scary, but the next scariest thing probably is illness on board ship. And that's where these journals really come in. This is John Harrell. He's traveling in the 1770s. He's a Scottish man, and he is on board this ship, and there are only something like 70 or 80 passengers on board his ship. Here we're about 3 or 4 weeks into the journey. He says, wind and weather and courses as before. The sick are now increasing to number 50 between decks, besides 3 in the steerage, 2 seamen and a passenger. And there is now a great deal of seaweed passing by. So he's giving everyday events going along here. And at this point in their travel, there are more than 50 sick on board ship, and there are probably less than 100. So more than half of those folks on board the ship are sick. It's both the passengers and the crew, and even the chief mate gets ill here. Many of them die, and they have to put them overboard. We don't know exactly how many in this particular trip died, but more than half of them got sick, and he helps nurse people along during this whole trip. And then there are times when he gets sick himself, fevers and whatnot they're having. You can imagine on a ship like this, the people that are traveling here are not well-to-do. They didn't have enough money for their trip, to pay for their trip in hand. So they have to basically borrow their labor into the future for that. So we know that they are not very well-to-do. These are poor people that are having to do this kind of travel, and they're being packed on board ship here. And the people that are running this ship, they have every reason to do it as cheap as possible. So they don't have a lot of provisions, they don't have a lot of room. And as difficult as Harrell's trip was, we have 2 different German folks that are traveling in the 1770s, and it makes Harrell's trip look like a trip in the park. These guys are on bigger ships, something like 200-300 passengers on board, men, women, and children. They're kind of corralled into these small areas, and illness really takes a big toll on these. I want to describe this illness to you, but it turns your stomach. They basically break out in pustules over their entire body, and they turn into one big scab, and it really sounds bad. The commenters, or the modern commenters in this book, believe that the illness is probably typhus that they're getting, which they get this disease is transmitted by lice that are probably infesting this ship from one trip to another. So this is happening over and over again. The patient was also afflicted with a constant fever, a loss of senses, exceedingly weak and fainty, especially when exposed to the air. I have seen some crawl upon deck who seem pretty cheerful while they remain beneath, but as soon as they came into the air, they fall into a swoon, if not expire. The mariners themselves, from the captain down to the ship's swab, did not escape the disorder. Now, not every trip was this bad, traveling in the 18th century by ship. It's generally accepted that the mortality rate of this trip was generally on the 5% range. So you can imagine that 1 out of 20 people died on the trip from Europe to America. Not very good odds, but on these trips, the mortality rate was something more like 15 to 25% of the folks died traveling. And even that wasn't the whole thing. The folks that were traveling from Europe to North America, because when they got to North America, they were experiencing a whole new set of diseases, and quite frequently people who emigrated would get sick within the first year and possibly die. So there was a much greater chance of folks dying in that first year after they got to America. So we can see how difficult it was. They described their living conditions, which, you know, were terribly unsanitary, cramped conditions over long periods of time. They had storms and everyone would get sick on board ship, and it was very difficult. Then they had the problems with their food. Then they had problems with illness. Today, if we want to go over to Europe, or Europeans want to come to America, hey, you hop on an airplane, and in half a day's time you're there. It's an easy trip. Very few people die of disease from one side to the other, and compared to what people make today, it's a very inexpensive trip, a very safe trip, and a very, very fast trip. So we can say, yeah, we want to go back into the 18th century. I want to live that simple life. But you certainly don't want to take that long trip from Europe to America in the 18th century. That would have been just a harrowing ordeal. Here's a piece from Johann Buchner's memoir. He says, after some time, I had a very violent fever that, as my companions told me, brought me to very near death. I suffered utter delirium, and the surgeon was obliged to let blood from both my arms, of which I knew nothing. Of this attack I remember not save the torture, like the suffering of the damned, that I saw constantly in my dreams. After I had recovered my mental balance, I often prayed with all my soul for the forgiveness of my trespasses and sins. John Frederick Whitehead, he writes, now, although the disease raged among us to a great degree, I kept in a good state of health till the beginning of August. Then it seemed as if not only the disease attacked me with all its fury, but I was also afflicted with, as I call it, an elephantic itch, for I never have seen such an itch to my memory in my life. For my arms and hands, both within and without, were almost covered with pustules nearly as big as a Spanish 5-pence, filled with yellow offensive matter. My thighs and hams were in the same condition, and the rest of my body was nearly covered with small red pustules resembling the seeds of fish. I many times have been made to think on Job, and thought I could truly say with him that I was loathsome to myself, and my garments did cling to my flesh, and its color changed with the violence of my disease, and what added greatly to my affliction was the inability of cleansing myself, by which I became almost covered with filth and lice. Thankfully, his shipmates come alongside him, and they clean him up, and he does recover from this just horrible, horrible illness. They were so short-handed at times. There were just very few people to work the ship, and they had great difficulty at different times because so many people were ill. There weren't people to fix the food. It got really, really bad. And these memoirs and journals are so rich with history and so descriptive of what was happening. And we can almost, we can for a short period really imagine just how bad it was, and then we can wake up and here we are in this wonderful, easy to travel world that we have today. And wow, I am truly thankful for the ability to travel like we have today, compared to these just amazingly difficult situations that they had in the 18th century. Thank you for coming along on this journey today back in history, when we can really get that feel, to see what it was really like back in history, to give us a sense of just how good we've got it today. Thanks for joining us.